Hi everyone, welcome to an episode with Tom Pickering and I for Eximius Executive, and we're going over one of your questions today. That question is, as a leader, what do you do if you have your team lose respect for you? So you sort of lose the vote of confidence in the dressing room, to put it in a sporting analogy. Great question. Thanks for everyone who keeps writing in and challenging all the time. Tom, where do you start with a subject like this? I'm sure you've seen this numerous times in your day-to-day.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is, Nick, people very often talk about their successes, but very rarely reflect on their failures. So I think it's a particularly interesting topic. And also, I think I'd just like to touch on two perspectives. One is the perspective of arriving in a business when it's things in a turnaround situation. It's frankly carnage. And in fact, it's not even individuals, but leadership, full stop, have lost credibility. And secondly, the other perspective, which is my experience of actually running some very successful businesses. And I've found the way I've been engaging has alienated people in a fairly overwhelming degree. And I'll just touch on why I think those things were the case.
Perfect.
So I think the first thing I'd like to add is when I arrive in a situation, typically, early in my career, I focused on the business, and being quite an analytical engineering type person, I can see the business issues very clearly, and of course that gives rise to a lot of negative dialogue, because it can sound quite critical. Whereas what I realised was, the first thing I learned from that was actually to walk around and understand that the perspective that actually they're a great bunch of people that may not have the right support. And I've very much learned that actually with very few exceptions, you've got the right team on the boat. They might be in the wrong seats, and everybody's actually doing their best. And so the antithesis to that, Nick, which is a far easier perspective to take, which I've fallen into on many occasions, is in a turnaround situation, it's very easy to think, and this is what most of my peers think, which is the reason why we developed the Winning Thinking program, is that the team are a bunch of idiots, because they've got the business into such a mess, which is a very easy IQ related sort of perspective on things, which of course turns people off quite dramatically when you arrive. Yeah.
That makes sense. And so how do you get them thinking? How do you get sort of the team back on track in all that sort of carnage and chaos?
Yeah.
How do you actually sort of bring it back to a point of an element of calm?
Well, the first thing is, Nick, if you need to, you've got to get rid of the wrong people very quickly. So I have got into board meetings, and I have fired managing directors there and then with no process whatsoever, because knowing that it's the right thing to do with the business and there's been no other option, because you simply cannot afford to have the wrong managing director around in a turnaround. It's just disastrous. That said, it's very much the exception. And actually the question I ask in that situation is, tell me about the challenges that you've had over the last 4 to 5 years and what you've done about them. And this particular managing director was a construction managing director. Construction businesses are pretty interesting at the best of times. And effectively he said he had these challenges and he did nothing about it. And actually that was enough to fire him there and then, which I did. But I did that with the full support of the stakeholders. So I already had the night before an agreement signed to have 25% of the business. And so it's very clear that we needed that sort of degree of clarity. And from that point, we moved into the turnaround. But that's actually quite rare. The second question I think is critical in the turnaround, and I think this is probably something that viewers might find helpful, is actually to ask the same question, but with a slightly different angle, which is to ask, tell me about the decisions you've made. And again, tell me about the challenges and the decisions. And what the other thing that tells you is the psychology of the business. So at what point, what were the critical things that determined where you are? Right or wrong, and that gives rise to the psychology. And I'll give you an example of that. So there was a tiling business, one of the very first businesses I looked in the turnaround context was a tiling business that imported tiles into the UK and then moved into retail. And guess what? They got themselves into trouble. And so, actually, rather than addressing the problem, you can see how they circumvent that. And that's all around the psychology and the generalizations, Nick, as to how things can go wrong. And the interesting thing is as well, I think when you look at the politics, we were just touching on this, I think, when we first started, was when you look at the profile of a lot of interim managers, they're actually quite aggressive, right? So what do I mean by that? They're actually very good at looking after themselves rather than addressing the issues. So they're very good at, in a corporate environment, protecting their own patch. And this is very much the Biden type approach. And in my view, Biden would have been someone I'd fired on day one. And the reason being, and VCs do call them day oneers, by the way. And he would have been a definite day oneer, I think, than most of the VCs I've ever worked for as well. The reason for that is that he externalizes, and that's a victim mentality. He uses a lot of generalizations, which is very aggressive. And those are both signs of people who are very good at looking after themselves and doing absolutely nothing.
Right. And how, so, I mean, your experience with them is they're people you look forward to clear out the way so you can actually get some real change on. When you find proactive leaders who've just found themselves in a tough spot, but they've already they can feel they've lost the support of them around them through, as you pointed out, the IQ piece. Everyone's scratching their head going, what's happened here? It's becoming a blame culture.
Yeah.
How do you sort of help with the reset to get people sort of back on track?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I do is I break down, rather than bombard people with my negative view of the business, which puts people off quite dramatically, right? What I do is I identify what are the key objectives, Nick, and that I use that to my strength. Within a couple of days, I can figure out what that is in terms of margin improvements, in terms of operational improvements, and I then figure out during that process, ask people a lot of questions, and I figure out who can do what, and then I give people a unique opportunity. I hand this to them, right? Literally physically hand it to them and let go of it and say, right, I want you to come back to me in 3 or 4 days' time and give me your plan. And I get the whole team together. And that develops complete accountability and also give them a budget as well. So they've got everything they need to do the job. And that's when it gets really exciting, Nick. And then I show people how to run a review. I show people how to remove the excuses. I then introduce some of the winning thinking type stuff if required. Normally, and also play back people's behaviors to themselves, a bit like a mirror, and that's just the most exciting process. The interesting thing about that process is it's quite unique, and because thinking's difficult, Nick, people really push back and they'll come back to you and say, no, and I've had this happen on a lot of occasions, Tom, will you just bloody well tell us what to do? Right? And I'll say, no, I won't. But you have to be careful with that, because you have to be careful you're not giving people something they're not clear on what they're doing, to make sure they have got, it's clear in their own mind, and or if they need technical help, you can switch into mental mode to give them a shove, because you don't want to leave people sort of hung up. But as long as I'm absolutely sure they can do the job and they just need to think it through, the challenge is to think it through. And what that does, Nick, is it very, very quickly gets to, and this is how I get businesses back to profit in 2 weeks. This very, very quickly gets to a high performance team. And I've talked about this again a lot, but it's about acknowledging people. So using people's names really matters. Something else I got very badly wrong when I was working with lots of women on the shop floor, and you get women's names wrong in your early career and you really suffer badly. And if you do it twice, you really get into trouble. And I was quite good at that when I was young. But I'm taking interest in themselves and who they are, and then really listening to them, Nick. They're really taking an interest in them, because most of what people comes out of their mouths, first of all, quite often doesn't make sense, including myself. And then you actually, like, where are you coming from? Where you may say something completely, please just explain to me, rather than just reject it. And there's one other thing as well. There's a couple of ground rules I put in place, which is never to interrupt people. That's absolutely staggering, because what that does is it makes people feel very accountable for how they use other people's time. Whereas the fear of that, of course, is that Tom's going to rabbit on forever, which I can, and I'll try and stop now, Nick.
No. This is the whole point of this show, is you get to rabbit on. That's what we're looking for here. So when you've gone through that process, and there's obviously a dynamic where the team could be blaming the leader in that, right? You've been brought in to help guide them through that. How do you, but at some point you leave, right? You're there, do a job, and you're onto it.
Yeah.
How do you sort of help that leader sort of transition back into that role, and actually start taking on themselves? And also, so that's question one. The second part of it is, in this in a negative situation where maybe accusations are flying that are not true, it sounds to me that actually the most proactive thing to do is focus on the go forward, and maybe not address, the who's right, who's wrong elements in it. It sounds like almost a waste of time. Is that correct? Am I interpreting that right?
So if I answer the first question first, and maybe you can remind me what the second question first, remind me what the first one was in a minute. But I think in terms of right or wrong, it's dodgy territory, Nick, because there's a great book written actually called, I can't remember what it's called, but it basically says you can never persuade anybody against their own opinion. What you can do, though, is you can change their actions, okay, which is, we started off talking about alienating the dressing room, okay. At least 50% of the dressing room, in my view, should be alienated. And I'll tell you why. Because they're learning, Nick, right? And they're not in their comfort zone. So if you are folding pieces of paper all day long and you've got no progression, sure enough, human beings are going to get fed up with that. So I do believe that actually, even if you've got a team of, I've run big leadership teams of 12 people, 12 direct reports, and there's normally about 6 of them who you get on quite well. There's 2 of them you get on really well with, and then you've got another 6 which are not really necessarily exactly, they're more difficult to speak to, Nick. Take more time, take more energy. Although I've understood better how to engage with those people, and I think the critical thing there is and actually that mix changes depending on what the challenge is. So you might be talking about one thing, and all the engineers get fed up, and all the the people-centric people switch on, but I think you need to have that degree of discomfort, and you need to stick to that as well. So, but it's about managing when that's becoming unbearable. So I do get criticised quite often by owners of businesses or shareholders, and say, "Look, Tom, you're pushing this too hard." And sometimes I do, but I do it with a love for people, Nick, to really understand what they can and can't do. Because without that stretch, you don't know what people can do. In fact, there's a beautiful guy from the Special Air Service, one of David Sterling's guys, who said, you don't know what you can do until you actually have a chance to do it. And those guys really did have some wonderful challenges. So I think that's very much how I lead. But I like to think with respect, and I like to think that no one ever feels threatened or like they're being hung out to dry.
Yeah, that's good. And the first part of this question was, how do you transition the manager back into that role? If you're like the Navy SEALs, sort of in and out, flash bang and gone. Yeah. How do you transition the manager back into that role without the business being dependent on you? Yeah. And being able to sort of get them back onto some levels of respect, I guess.
Yeah, great. So to answer that question, great one, Nick. So I think. What I do, right, is if I give you something to do, Nick, I don't mess about with it, right? But I'll show you how to interact with your peers and how to run a review. So I won't say, Nick, look, blah, 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 blah. I might ask you a few questions, okay? And people in the early reviews, what the hell's Tom doing? What's happening here? But then I see it. It's like a flower coming out. And when you, are given the unique opportunity to do something in your own way, Nick, it becomes quite unstoppable when you get that right. And so actually, I've struggled to stay on top of this from time to time because it gets quite overwhelmingly energetic when you get this right. So I think the fear of that, when you do get it right, I have not always got it right. But when you put the structure in place, reviews in place, and I build a capability roadmap, which includes the organizational bits as different teams, etc. When you get that right, it basically runs itself, and I don't really need to do anything, Nick. And actually, I don't want to do anything. The thing I tend to do is just raise the bar of the leaders. So, with regards to the psychology, the winning thinking type stuff, there's a depth of knowledge I've got there where people are making statements which can be problematic, and that's the sort of, but that doesn't take me very much time. So, and I literally have got a team. I'm going to give you an example of this. Literally, there's a business 7 million turnover, hemorrhaging 400,000 a month, and I got this business back to profit in 2 weeks. The two leaders were a pair of crooks, Nick. They were absolutely, really, but I showed them how to run this review, and this team was so unstoppable. They got the business back to profit in 2 weeks in their own way, and that business survived for 12 months with no involvement from me whatsoever. I didn't manage to do a deal on that one because these two owners chopped me out because they were sharks. But it gave me a huge sense of satisfaction that actually that thing ran by itself for 12 months, having hemorrhaged £400,000 a month, and it was beyond dead. So I think, although I don't want to use this inappropriately, but I do think the situation in Afghanistan is not unlike what happens when you do leave, although it's a horrible situation, in terms of the existing leadership team getting back to control and doing things in their own way, Nick. And you have to let that happen. It's very easy to look on the sidelines and think, well, I know better, but actually, it's very important to let go and let the politics reform. And I think, so I think that's what good looks like for me, Nick. It's really getting the team to a state of energy where it's pretty much unstoppable.
Yeah, that makes sense. And once you are out of a business, though, and you've gone through this process, do you find it's something where if they come and approach you again about smoothing things out, is that stuff that's you find interesting? Do you think that that's still within your skill set to help on that, or is it frankly more of the solving the bigger, more immediate problems that's gets you going?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it for sure. I think it's about playing to our strengths, Nick. Really. So I'm not good at doing nothing. Okay, most of my work I get done by 10 o'clock in the morning. I start early, right, and then I wonder, I wonder what I'm going to do for the rest of the day very often. And so I'm not a good person to have around for, without anything to do. I start creating energy and excitement, where it's not necessarily required. So I'm very conscious of what plays to my strengths. That said, when you're running an operation, actually, there are, particularly when there's a significant amount of breadth, there's a significant number of things that you can do to raise the bar over an extended period of time. Some of that stuff might be over a long period of time, but might not take me very long, Nick. So it tends to be, sort of light touch stuff. And I think the challenge does change. And there's a leadership support aspect to some of this stuff. But if I can do that in a couple of days a month, just by chatting to the champion, I tend to put champions in place, Nick, so I can step away. I can do things that play to my strengths, but stay in contact just to help people, where possible. And very often, I gave an example of this. What how some of the best work I've done, even though I say it myself. There's a guy who is 28. I got him. Who was struggling, physical signs of stress, very nasty situation, couldn't cope with it. He now is a main board director of a $1 billion turnover business. He's still about 15 years younger than I am, and became very, very successful. And to be honest, I just broke that cycle. I showed him how to cope with different situations he hadn't necessarily faced himself. And that's what good looks like to me, Nick. And, that guy's just left that particular organization and, just been extraordinarily successful. And I think that's really, what good looks like to me. It's people who become far more successful than I do.
Yeah. And is that part of the art of turnaround? You've created an environment where you've plugged the main hole, you've turned it around to a position where it's doing well. You've now actually created an environment where you can delve a bit deeper into bigger issues, sometimes the more systemic issues in the business. But at least there's an opportunity to do that now, right?
Yeah. So what actually on that point, what I tend to do is actually look after the longer time frame, Nick. So there's a lot of businesses that need to be thinking 12 months ahead who aren't. And I've been in situations where they've been so fast moving tech businesses where you need to plan to replace your supply chain in 6 months, right? And so unless somebody's thinking about that and planning for that, you're going to have a horrible surprise. And I think that's the framework that I tend to operate in. And then so I've been in situations where I've been globally sourcing, traveling around the world with a team that looks after itself, investigating different suppliers, looking at the different options, to really make sure it's all, deciding, for example, if you're servicing Europe, Middle East, and Africa, where you should put, your distribution center. It's a very big decision. How you're going to set it up, how you're going to get the operation, where you're going to manufacture, etc. That requires a lot of thought. So you have to see a lot of different options to really inform those decisions. So I tend to take that sort of time frame if I'm in an operational role. But again, I can do a lot of that stuff remotely. I can work with people to show them how to do that sort of thing, because it's about freeing up his time, Nick. And because a lot of people would simply say they're too busy. Okay, and I say to people, and they never believe me because it sounds utterly ridiculous, but 70% of your time is wasted, right? And I can show you, I can show you the analysis of how to do that. And it's all around the thinking. It's all around, what we were talking about earlier. What are those diversionary things that businesses are doing that they can stop to free the time to focus on your core business and really, get cooking on gas. So it's extraordinary how much waste there is in the business, Nick, even small businesses.
Oh, I'm sure. I think we've all seen that. Last question for today. So, how long do you think you give it before? I guess actually, let me rephrase differently. The leaders sometimes want to brush whatever's happened under the rug, right, and be like, move on. Let's be positive. That's good. And some of the team members, at some point, will have to move on as well, right, and be forward. Have you seen a normal cutoff point where if team members aren't sort of actually moving forward, where it becomes serious issues? Like, how do you sort of leave a mindset for, like, I guess almost forgiveness about, like, we have to just push on now, or get together to really work through those problems?
Yeah, I think, Nick, there's a natural trajectory of a business, okay? And I think that plan is pretty, if you get it right, it's pretty much out of your control, right? The challenge is, who do you need to have on the boat to get there? And so I think what can happen, and sometimes, as I said before, when you're raising the bar, you don't quite know who can make it. But you can take away all the excuses, but I've come across situations where 6 months into this process, I've had to move a managing director out of their role because they hadn't got the headroom, and I hadn't anticipated that until we got to that point. So for example, that sometimes you find a managing director is very sales focused, but can't manage some of the operational stuff, or can't get his head around the financials, and actually has no aptitude for that, right? It's very difficult when you first form a team to anticipate that. So I think, and also that the challenge should get steeper, and whilst you can develop a team and do all the things we've been talking about, actually people will run out of space or headroom, and in that situation you need to move people around, with regards to what the business can offer, because the business can only offer what it can offer, and sometimes you need to remove people. So I've done both. I think my heart is absolutely about the latter, to retain people, but and I think the other thing I'd say is that very often when I join an organization or working with an organization, you find that people are actually in the wrong seats, so actually they're in the wrong roles. So you've got a managing director who's doing a product development role, and no one's looking after the financials, or the bookkeeper's doing a finance director role, or and actually they need to be raise the bar, or maybe they can't make that transition. And so you've got all this sort of stuff. So I think you put the framework in place, you test the framework, you give people lots of opportunities. But if you're doing things right, that bar should raise incrementally higher and higher, because the challenge isn't going away. You've got to get better at doing it. It goes without saying. It's a bit like tennis players. I just can't believe, any sport, the 200 meters always gets done faster every year, Nick. I mean, I don't know how the hell. I mean, it just sounds biologically bonkers, doesn't it? Or any sport, it gets tougher. Cycling, whatever. How is that? I think it's probably got a lot to do with the opportunity and just raising the bar, because we're very adaptable as human beings. But there does come a point where people run out of headroom.
Yeah, I think your athletics point is bang on. I think, science and marginal gains are taking this pretty close now. Like every manufactured advantage is sort of being created now, and you can see that sort of plateau. It's a conversation for another time, but obviously that's the aftermath of something like that, being surrounded by people who are not prepared to positively try and move forward, is really interesting, because someone's going to break in that situation. Someone's, the manager's either going to go, I need something back. Like, you've got to be on board with this. Like, it's, yes, it's happened, let's move forward. Or the member of staff, I'm going to take myself in this situation. I can't sort of actually move past this. It's a pretty unproductive environment sort of working, but that's probably a chat for another time, or the impact, we'll get David on as well and do the impacts of negativity or the impacts of positivity. Right. For someone who's like yourself, who's an energy giver and creates energy, it'd be great to get your takes on those things another time. But otherwise, thank you for some whirlwind insight into part of the turnaround world, actually. And I think a lot of people get nervous about understanding what it is and the impact it is. But I mean, the fact you are getting people to a place where they can live to fight another day, take a breath to make some proper decisions on the business is critical, and gets lost a little bit sometimes in the world when it comes to what's perceived to be done. And you're there to enable the team to move forward and remove yourself, rather than become a drug they live and breathe off, right? And depend on. So, but and thank you to everyone who's keep throwing in these great questions, stumping us. We try and do a little bit of prep, but we try and keep this as open as we can do, so we can speak as honestly as we can, as you hopefully get that from the flow of the conversation back and forward. But thank you all. If you want to talk any more about scaling your business, about actually turning around, re-energizing a team, a unit, it doesn't have to be broken, it could be just a key stage of growth, reach out and we can get the team together and come and do some work with you to understand where your holes might be and key bits you need to address within your team to push on. But otherwise, thank you to Tom for your time as always, and thanks to all at home, and we'll catch you again very, very soon. All the best. Bye.